Have you ever watched your wife laugh in your kitchen and say she found someone better, only for the better man to walk in at the exact wrong second, then realize the real question isn't who she chose, but how far she'll go to erase you? My name is Adrian Vale, and I learned that timing is a weapon long before I learned it was a marriage problem. I came home to the smell of reheated coffee and false confidence, the kind that hangs in the air when someone thinks they finally control the story. The kitchen light was too bright for early afternoon, and my wife stood under it like she belonged in a spotlight, smiling as if she had rehearsed the angle of her chin. She laughed, not because something was funny, but because laughter makes cruelty sound casual. She told me she was leaving me, and that she had found someone better than me, like she was returning a defective product. I had expected a lot of things over the last year, mostly small disappointments packaged as normal life, but I had not expected the ease in her face. There was no tremor in her fingers, no panic behind the grin, no sign that she had imagined I might respond like a human being with ribs. She wanted a scene, the kind where I beg and she wins, the kind where she can tell people later that I was unstable and she was brave. I gave her what she could not use, which was a quiet smile and the patience of a man reading a contract. It is strange what you notice when your heart stops doing its job for a moment. I noticed the suitcase by the pantry door, standing upright like a witness. I noticed the second coffee mug rinsed and left to dry, placed on the rack with the handle turned outward, which is not how she leaves things when she is alone. I noticed her phone face down on the counter, close enough to her palm that she could flip it fast, and far enough from me that she could call it privacy. I noticed that she had worn perfume she only wears when she wants to be remembered, and that she had done her hair the way she used to do it when we were still pretending. She said the name like it was a trophy, like the syllables were supposed to sting. Nolan. She said it with that bright, careless tone people use when they believe the future has already agreed with them. Nolan was not a stranger to me, which was the part she did not understand, because she had been living inside the fantasy where I was clueless by design. In her version, I was a husband-shaped object that paid bills and took blame, and she could step out of the frame whenever the lighting got harsh. I kept my eyes on her face, because faces betray what mouths try to sell. Her confidence was real, but it was stitched together from borrowed assumptions. She had assumed I would explode, and that assumption was doing most of the work. She had assumed Nolan was coming with a clean halo and a clean plan, and assumptions like that always collapse under daylight. I let a beat pass, slow enough to feel cruel, and then I let my smile widen as if I was about to congratulate her. I used a soft voice, the kind that makes people lean in and realize too late they are the ones exposed. I said his name back to her, not like a rival, but like a file label. I watched her eyes flicker because she did not like hearing me say it calmly. She wanted Nolan to be a private password between them, and I was turning it into a public word. I said I did not want to upset her, and I meant it the way a surgeon means they do not want to damage healthy tissue. I told her there was something she should know about Nolan, and I did not rush it, because rushing is for people who fear losing control. Control is not a feeling, it is a sequence of choices, and I had been choosing for a while without letting her see it. Her smile faltered for the first time, but it did not die yet. She thought I was bluffing, because bluffing is what she would do. She tightened her grip on the counter edge, nails pressing into laminate like she could anchor herself to the moment. She tried to keep her posture tall, even as her shoulders lifted a fraction, and I knew she was suddenly listening for sounds in the house, the way you listen for consequences. The front door opened without hesitation, as if whoever held the key believed the place belonged to them. I did not move, because I had expected it. My wife stiffened like her body had been warned before her mind could catch up. There were footsteps on the hallway runner, heavy enough to be confident and careless enough to be loud. A man cleared his throat, not to be polite, but to announce himself, and the sound made my wife's grin crack into something brittle. Nolan stepped into the kitchen like he had practiced the entrance in his head. He was taller than me by an inch, maybe two, with the kind of posture built from boardrooms and rooms where people applaud the wrong things. His hair was neat in a way that suggests routine, and his shirt looked expensive in the quiet way expensive things look. He was carrying a slim leather bag, the kind that holds a laptop and a life you do not want your spouse to see. He started with a confident expression that assumed my wife was alone, and then his eyes landed on me. You can watch a man's identity rearrange itself in half a second if you give him the right surprise. Nolan's steps slowed, and his gaze darted to my wife, searching her face for an explanation she could not afford to give. My wife's smile vanished so fast it looked like it had been pulled off her skin. Her mouth opened as if she had prepared a line, but nothing came out, because this was not the version where she controlled the cuts. For a heartbeat, the three of us stood in a triangle of bad decisions. The refrigerator hummed, the faucet dripped once, and somewhere outside, a car alarm chirped and died, like the world briefly objected and then got bored. Nolan's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation, the same look men use when a meeting turns hostile and they need to decide what to sacrifice first. He kept his hand on the strap of his bag as if it was a shield. My wife looked between us, trying to read the room fast enough to rewrite it. She had always been good at shifting blame in real time, turning facts into fog. I had watched her do it to friends, to her sister, to strangers on customer service calls. She could cry on command when it served her, and she could laugh when she needed to look harmless. But now she was trapped between a husband who was calm and a lover who had not expected an audience. I stayed still and let silence do the work, because silence is an accusation that does not need proof. Nolan tried to speak first, because men like him think talking is control. He aimed his attention at my wife, not at me, as if I was furniture or a problem she should handle. My wife flinched at that, and I caught it, because being treated like a handler is not romantic. It is humiliating. I looked at Nolan and let my expression settle into something polite and flat. I did not glare, because glares are fuel, and I had no intention of powering their story. I gave him the kind of look you give someone who has walked into the wrong room and is about to be charged for it. Nolan's face twitched, and I saw the moment he realized this was not going to be a private conversation with a messy wife and a disposable husband. I said his name again, and this time I watched him react to it, not her. I told him I appreciated him coming by because it saved time. I watched my wife's throat bob as she swallowed panic, and I could almost hear her mind scrambling for a new plan. She had packed suitcases, but she had not packed a strategy for Nolan meeting me under her roof. Nolan's eyes flicked to the suitcase, then to my wife's phone, then back to me. He was mapping the scene like a man deciding whether to run or negotiate. My wife, for the first time in a long time, looked small, not physically, but in the way her confidence folded inward. She was realizing that the version of Nolan she had built was not the Nolan standing in front of her now. I leaned back against the counter, slow and casual, like I had all the time in the world, because I did. I told my wife she had said Nolan was better than me, and I admitted that might be true in some categories. I let that hang long enough to sting, because nothing scares a manipulator more than a victim who refuses the expected script. Then I turned my attention to Nolan and told him there was one detail he deserved to hear before anyone made another move. My wife's eyes widened, and she shook her head once, tiny and desperate, like she was trying to erase the next sentence before it existed. Nolan's jaw tightened, and he finally looked directly at me with the cold irritation of a man who hates surprises. I kept my voice even, because even voices make chaos look childish. I told Nolan that my wife had been using his name as a promise, and I told him he should check what she promised me last week, in writing, before he decided what he was buying. My wife's breath caught, sharp and thin, and the sound was the first honest thing she had made all day. Nolan's eyes narrowed further, not because he believed me, but because a man like him always fears paper. My wife stepped forward as if to stop me, then stopped herself when she realized both of us were watching her. She glanced at the hallway, like she was calculating distance, like suitcases were an escape route and not a prop. Nolan's hand tightened on his bag strap, and his posture shifted. Defensive now, like the floor beneath him had turned slick. I paused, just long enough to let them fill the silence with their own worst guesses. Then I reached into the drawer beside me, the one my wife never checks because she thinks she knows this house better than I do, and I pulled out a single envelope with Nolan's name printed on the front, in clean block letters. My wife went pale as if the kitchen light had finally decided to be honest. Nolan stared at the envelope like it was a threat he could not fire or ignore, and I held it between two fingers, calm as a man about to flip the first card. The envelope was not a threat in the dramatic sense, because I did not do dramatic anymore, and Nolan could tell. It was plain, heavy paper, the kind you choose when you want a document to feel final before anyone reads it. I held it out in front of me without offering it, because offering would have made this a favor. My wife stared at it like it was a snake that had learned her name, and Nolan stared at it like it was an invoice he never approved. He tried to keep his face neutral, but men like Nolan are trained to hide discomfort, not confusion. And this was confusion. He had walked into a kitchen expecting a victory lap, a clean exit, a woman who believed he was her rescue plan. He had not expected the husband to be waiting, calm and worse, prepared. My wife's hands hovered near her waist, not quite reaching for anything, not quite surrendering either, because she could not decide which version of herself would survive. Nolan finally asked what it was, and he asked it like a manager asking why the numbers are wrong. He did not ask my wife, which was the first crack in her fantasy, because the fantasy required him to treat her as a partner. I watched her swallow again, and I watched the small shiver in her shoulders because the spotlight had turned and it was not flattering. I told him it was the part of the story he had not been given. I told him it was the part that makes people stop smiling when they think they are winning. My wife took one step closer to me, then stopped when she saw my eyes stay on Nolan, because she realized I was not going to be pulled into a private argument. She wanted to speak over me, to correct, to soften, to do the frantic interior decorating she always did when truth entered the room. I did not give her a wall to hang it on. Nolan asked again, slower this time, and his hand slipped from the bag strap to his pocket, which was a small gesture of self-control returning. I told him, in the same tone I might use to explain a policy, that the envelope contained a timeline and a statement, and a copy of a complaint I had not filed yet. My wife's eyes widened at the word complaint, because she heard consequences in it, and consequences are the only language she respects. She tried to laugh, but it came out thin and cracked, and it died on her tongue when Nolan did not join in. She said I was being ridiculous, and she tried to paint it as jealousy, because jealousy is messy and easy to dismiss. I nodded once, as if I were agreeing that ridiculousness was common in the house, and then I slid the envelope a little closer to Nolan, not into his hands, just close enough that he could see his own name printed cleanly. His jaw tightened. He looked at my wife, and that look was not affectionate anymore. It was evaluative, cold, and my wife felt it. She shifted her weight as if she had suddenly remembered there was no safe place to stand. I told Nolan I was not asking him to believe me, because belief is a luxury, and I was not here to sell stories. I told him to open it and read the first page, and if I was wrong, he could walk out and never think about me again. Nolan hesitated, because opening an envelope in front of two people feels like admitting you are part of the scene. My wife's gaze jumped between us, and I saw the fear on her face grow teeth. Nolan reached out and took the envelope, and the movement was careful, like he expected it to bite him. He opened it with a thumbnail, slow enough that my wife could have snatched it, and she did not, because she was already too late. He pulled out the first sheet, and I watched his eyes move over the top lines, then stop, then go back. Because he had not expected dates. He had expected accusations, maybe drama, maybe a man trying to fight for his marriage with noise. He was staring at a quiet list of times and places. My wife leaned in as if she could read over his shoulder, then jerked back when she saw the header. Her mouth opened, and nothing came out, because she recognized her own routine written down in black ink. There is a specific kind of fear when you realize someone has been watching patterns you thought were invisible. It is not fear of violence, because I was not violent. It is fear of being known. Nolan's eyes lifted to me, and for the first time, he looked unsettled rather than annoyed. He asked where I got it, and I said the same place he should have gotten it, which was the life my wife had been living in my house. I told him I did not need to hack anything or follow anyone, because most betrayal is lazy, and lazy betrayal leaves crumbs on the floor. My wife made a small sound, a protest that was not a sentence, and Nolan ignored her again. He scanned the page, then the second, and his breathing shifted. He was reading a short entry about a mentorship dinner that matched a receipt on a shared account and a late meeting that overlapped a calendar item that was supposed to be private, but was not. He was reading about the same excuse used twice within 3 days, written down like a script, and his face tightened because he recognized manipulation when it appeared in tidy formatting. My wife tried to step between us, but Nolan's shoulder blocked her without effort, and that was the moment she understood she was not the center of his decisions. She said Nolan did not need to read that, and she told him it was personal, and she tried to treat it like an invasion. Nolan did not look at her while he answered, and that answer landed in the room like a door closing. He asked whether I was planning to ruin him. He did not say it like a plea, because he could not afford to plead, but he could not hide the calculation. I told him I was planning to protect myself, and if his reputation got bruised on the way, that was a consequence, not a goal. I watched my wife flinch at the word consequence again, because she was beginning to realize she had entered a game where I was not chasing her. I was moving around her. Nolan asked what I wanted, and he said it like a negotiation had already started. I told him I wanted clarity, and I wanted the truth to exist outside my wife's mouth. I told him I wanted him to understand that my wife had been selling him a version of me that was useful, and that version would not survive contact with paper. My wife snapped that I was lying, and I turned my head toward her slowly, like I had all night. I told her she could call me a liar, and she could call me bitter, and she could call me whatever she needed to feel taller, but she could not unprint dates. I told her she could not unring the bell of Nolan reading what she had hidden. Nolan folded the pages once, as if he needed to make them smaller to breathe, and then he looked at her fully for the first time since he entered. His voice was low, but his question cut the room cleanly. He asked whether she told me she was leaving, and whether she planned to make him the reason. My wife tried to recover, and she did the thing she always did when cornered, which was to half-confess in a way that makes the listener feel responsible. She said she had been unhappy for years, and she said I had been distant, and she said Nolan had shown her what she deserved. I listened, and I did not interrupt, because I wanted Nolan to hear her in full. When she finished, she looked at him with a pleading softness, like she was trying to pull him back into the fantasy. Nolan's eyes did not soften. They sharpened, because he was hearing himself described as a reward, and men like Nolan hate being used even when they are using someone else. He asked her whether she had told me his name on purpose. My wife hesitated, and that hesitation was the honest answer. She said she had not meant it like that, and she said she was upset, and she said she had wanted to be free. Nolan looked at me again, and in that look I saw something new, which was the fear of having walked into a trap without noticing the door close. I told Nolan I was not filing anything today, because today was for understanding the map. I told him I had a draft of an ethics complaint for their workplace, and I told him it would not mention feelings, only times, places, and policy language. I told him the file contained 1 page that listed the relevant sections in plain terms, and a second page that matched those sections to events I could document without guessing. I told him I was keeping it clean for a reason, because clean proof spreads faster than gossip. My wife took a sharp breath, and she asked if I was threatening her job, because that was the thing she cared about most in the moment. I told her I was not threatening anything, and I was simply making sure the consequences could not be edited by her friends. She stared at me as if she was seeing a stranger, and in a way she was. The version of me she had relied on was the one who argued, the one who begged, the one who forgave too quickly. That man was gone, and I had not asked permission. Nolan's posture shifted again, and he tried to reclaim control by changing the subject. He asked why I had Nolan's name printed on the envelope, and why I had prepared it like a delivery. I told him because I had a rule, and the rule was that everyone involved should hold the same facts in their hands before they spoke. I told him my wife had been running 2 narratives, and I was ending that habit. My wife made a sound of anger, then swallowed it, because Nolan was watching her with suspicion now. Nolan asked if there was more, and I nodded. I told him there was a second section, and it was smaller, and it was the part that would matter if he tried to act like this was only an affair. My wife's face went rigid, and her eyes locked on me with a warning that came too late. Nolan flipped to the next sheet, and I watched him read the header. The second section was not about romance. It was about access. It was about my wife's recent work tasks that had started to look like private errands, and the way certain expenses had appeared on an account I controlled. It was about a pattern that suggested she had been using my money to lubricate Nolan's life while telling herself it was love. Nolan's cheeks tightened as he read, and I saw the flash of anger, because no man likes the implication that he has been subsidized. My wife snapped that I was twisting things, and she reached for the paper, but Nolan pulled it away without looking at her. That small motion, that casual refusal, hit her harder than anything I could have said. She froze, and her eyes filled with a panic that did not look like regret, but like loss of leverage. Nolan asked her directly whether she had used my account for gifts, travel, or dinners, and he asked it like an auditor, not a lover. My wife tried to deny it, then corrected herself, then tried to justify it, and every shift made Nolan's expression colder. I watched her realize that she had imagined Nolan as a knight, and he was turning out to be a judge. She turned to me then, furious, and she demanded to know what I wanted, because she had finally accepted I was not playing defense. I told her I wanted one thing first, and I wanted it said clearly and in front of Nolan, because I was done with private explanations. I told her to state what she believed Nolan was to her and what she believed she was to Nolan, and to do it without decoration. My wife stared at me, breathing hard, and I saw her choose between pride and survival. She looked at Nolan as if she expected rescue, and Nolan did not move. He stood there holding pages like they were evidence in a hearing, and his silence was the loudest sound in the kitchen. My wife's confidence, the shiny thing she had worn earlier, was gone now, and in its place was a raw calculation. She finally said she was leaving me, and she said she had chosen Nolan. She said it like she was trying to keep her spine straight. Nolan's eyes stayed on her face, and something in him shifted, because now he was being assigned responsibility out loud. That is when I reached into the envelope again and pulled out the last sheet, the one I had not mentioned yet, and I placed it on the counter between us like a closing statement. My wife saw the top line and went white because she recognized my signature, and she recognized the date. Nolan leaned forward to read, and his eyes narrowed as he understood it was a formal notice, already prepared, already ready to be delivered. My wife whispered my name like it was an accusation, and I watched her hands tremble, because she had just realized the part she thought would happen later was already here, waiting. Nolan looked up from the paper and asked, carefully, what day I planned to file it, and I let the silence stretch until my wife could not breathe comfortably inside it. Then I told him the day depended on what my wife did next, and I watched her face change as she understood the decision was no longer hers alone. Nolan held the paper like it had weight beyond ink, and for the first time, he stopped acting like a visitor and started acting like a defendant. My wife's gaze kept snapping between his face and mine, searching for the easiest throat to squeeze, and finding neither. I watched her mouth form arguments before her brain checked if Nolan was still on her side, because she had built this whole exit on the assumption that men stay loyal when they are flattered. The problem with assumptions is that they behave like glass, and once they crack, you see your reflection in every shard. I told Nolan the day was not negotiable in the usual sense, because I was not bargaining for love or closure or a second chance. I told him the day depended on whether my wife tried to rewrite the story in a way that damaged me, and whether he helped her do it. I said it calmly, because calm is a weapon people do not recognize until it is already inside the room. My wife let out a bitter laugh, the kind that is supposed to make a man feel small, and it failed because Nolan did not laugh with her. He was still reading, still processing, still realizing that stepping into someone's kitchen can turn into stepping into someone's record. She started to call me controlling, which was her favorite costume for me when she wanted sympathy. She said I was trying to trap her, and she said Nolan did not need to listen to me because I was hurt and embarrassing myself. I let her finish because I wanted Nolan to notice how quickly she reached for character assassination when facts were present. Nolan's eyes stayed on the paper, then lifted to me again, and I could see the question behind his stare, the quiet one that says, "If she does this to him, what does she do to me?" He asked what I meant by rewriting the story, and he asked it in that careful tone men use when they are trying to keep their options open. I told him she would do what people like her always do when the ground moves, which is announce that the ground was already broken and blame the person who pointed it out. I told him she would hint I was unstable, jealous, maybe even threatening, because it is easier to poison a witness than answer a timeline. My wife's face tightened because I was describing her strategy the way a mechanic describes a dent, and she hated being reduced to something observable. Nolan asked if I was planning to speak to their workplace, and I told him I had prepared to, because preparation is the difference between justice and a tantrum. I said the draft did not accuse anyone of romance because romance is noise, and policies hate noise. I said it listed conflicts of interest, misuse of resources, and a pattern of decisions that would look bad under even casual review. Nolan's brow furrowed, and my wife's eyes widened again, because she was hearing the word pattern and realizing she had been treated like a case, not a spouse. She snapped that I had no proof of any of that, and she reached for Nolan's arm like she could pull him back into intimacy. Nolan did not move closer to her, and that hesitation hit her like a slap she could not show. I told her I did not need to prove feelings, and I did not need to guess intentions, because proof is not about why someone did something. Proof is about what happened, when it happened, and who benefited from it. Nolan finally asked what I wanted from him, specifically from him, and he said it like he was trying to define his risk. I told him I wanted him to stop pretending he had walked into a romance and start admitting he had walked into a plan. I told him he could leave right now, walk out of my kitchen, and decide he never wanted to be part of her mess again. I also told him, without raising my voice, that if he stayed and tried to help her bury this, I would treat him like an active participant, not a charming accessory. My wife inhaled sharply, as if I had just threatened violence, and that was almost funny, because the only thing I was threatening was sunlight. Nolan looked at her then, truly looked, and I saw him reading her the way he should have read her from the beginning. He asked her why she chose tonight to make her announcement, and why she brought him into my home like a trophy. My wife opened her mouth, then closed it, because the honest answer would have sounded ugly. She wanted a scene where I begged, where Nolan watched me shrink, where her new life began with my humiliation. She wanted to feel powerful at my expense, and she wanted Nolan to be the witness who proved she was desirable. Instead, she was now the person standing in the middle of a kitchen with her life spread out on paper. She tried a different angle, softer, pleading, and she told Nolan she had not meant for it to be like this. She said she wanted to be honest, and she said she wanted to be happy, and she said I was turning it into a lawsuit. Nolan's expression barely changed, but his eyes hardened because he was hearing her mix of innocence and entitlement. He looked back at me, and he asked, carefully, what the paper on the counter was, the one with my signature and a date, the one that had drained the color from her face. I told him it was a separation filing draft, prepared, not filed, with a timeline attached as an exhibit. I told him it did not accuse her of anything illegal, and it did not ask for revenge. It asked for clean terms, controlled assets, and a formal boundary. I told him I had already spoken to a mediator about procedure, not about gossip, because procedure is how you keep the liar from driving. My wife hissed my name like it was a curse, because she had expected me to be emotional, and I had chosen administrative. Nolan exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath since he walked in. He said, almost to himself, that this had escalated fast. I told him it had not escalated fast. It had escalated quietly, and quiet escalation feels sudden only to people who do not pay attention. My wife started to cry, or tried to, but the tears did not land the way they used to, because Nolan was watching her like she might be performing. She wiped her eyes quickly and glared at me, as if I had forced her into a role she did not want to play. She demanded to know what I would do if she simply left tonight, if she walked out with Nolan and never came back. She said it like a dare, like she was testing whether I still cared enough to chase. I nodded once and told her she could leave, because I was not her jailer. I told her the filing would proceed on schedule if she tried to smear me on the way out, and I told her it would proceed even faster if she attempted to take money or property under a false story. Nolan's eyes flicked to her, sharp, because he heard the phrase "take money," and realized he might be financing more than a relationship. My wife snapped that she had rights, and I said she did, which is exactly why I had kept everything civil. I told her rights are not the same as immunity, and that was when Nolan finally put the papers down and stepped back from the counter. He looked like a man reconsidering the value of a prize he had not paid for, and he looked uncomfortable that the price tag was now visible. He asked her quietly if she was pregnant, and the word hung there like smoke. My wife froze for half a second too long, and then she tried to laugh again, a small, brittle sound. She said it was none of his business in front of me, and she said it was personal. Nolan's face tightened, because a man does not like being invited into a family demolition and then told he cannot ask about the explosives. He looked at me, and he asked if I had heard her say it, or if I was inferring. I told him I heard it, because I came home early, because I opened the door quietly, because I listened to her on the phone. I told him I did not confront her that night, because confronting a liar privately only gives them time to rehearse. My wife's eyes flashed with anger at the word liar, but she did not deny the call, not directly, because she knew how it would look now. Nolan's mouth pressed into a line, and he nodded slowly, absorbing the fact that her confession was not just to him and not just about him. My wife tried to regain control by attacking me again, and she said I was spying, that I was sneaking around, that I was violating her privacy. I almost smiled, because people like her treat ordinary observation as surveillance when it catches them. I told her I listened from my own hallway, in my own house, and if that counted as spying, then she had been spying on my life for years. Nolan rubbed his thumb along the edge of the paper, a small, anxious motion, and I could see him trying to decide whether the smartest move was to exit quietly or to ask one more question that might change everything. He asked her directly if the baby was his. My wife's throat moved, and she looked at him with a mix of fear and frustration, like she wanted him to be brave for her. She did not answer quickly, and Nolan noticed. He glanced at me again, as if I held the missing line, and I did, but not as certainty, because I had refused to chase certainty through her words. I told Nolan I did not know paternity, and I would not pretend to, because pretending is her skill, not mine. I told him what I knew was that she was planning to leave me to build a real family with him, and that line had been said with confidence, not doubt. My wife flinched at the phrase real family, because hearing her own cruelty spoken out loud made it sound uglier than it had felt in the moment. Nolan's face darkened, not with heartbreak, but with insult, because he realized she had turned him into a prop in a speech. He asked her why she would say something like that, and she tried to explain, and the explanation turned into excuses, and the excuses turned into accusations about how I had made her lonely. Nolan listened, but I could see he was no longer listening for love, and that shift was fatal for her. He finally said he needed to leave, and my wife's head snapped toward him like she had been slapped again. She asked what he meant, and Nolan said he did not mean forever, but he needed time. My wife's face tightened with panic, because time is where consequences grow. She grabbed at his sleeve, and the motion was sharp enough that it looked desperate, and Nolan pulled his arm away gently but firmly. I watched the humiliation land on her, quiet and internal, because she had expected Nolan to carry her out like a hero. Instead, Nolan walked toward the door like a man leaving a meeting he should not have attended. My wife turned on me, furious, and she demanded to know if I was happy now, if this was what I wanted, if I enjoyed ruining her. I told her I enjoyed accuracy, and accuracy tends to ruin lies. I told her I had not asked Nolan to come here, and I had not dragged him into my kitchen, and I had not announced a replacement like I was shopping for appliances. I told her she had made this public the moment she invited him into our home, and I had simply refused to be the only person embarrassed. Nolan paused at the door, hand on the knob, and he looked back at us with a face that had lost its charm. He asked my wife quietly whether she had told anyone else a story about me, whether she had framed me as angry, unstable, or dangerous. My wife opened her mouth to deny it, then hesitated, and Nolan saw the hesitation. He nodded once, like a man checking a box, then he left without another word. The door closed, and the air changed immediately because the audience was gone, and the actress had no one to impress. My wife stared at the closed door as if she could reopen it by force of will. Then she looked at me with hatred so pure it was almost simple. She said I had ruined everything, and she said I had no right to do this, and she said I would regret it. I nodded again, because she always promised regret as if it were a curse she controlled. I told her regret was already in the room, and it was not mine. I told her she had one choice tonight, and it was not about whether she stayed or left, because staying was not a gift anymore. I told her the choice was whether she tried to weaponize a false narrative, because if she did, I would stop protecting her from the consequences she had earned. She demanded to know what that meant, and I told her it meant I would file cleanly, quickly, and with enough documentation to make lying expensive. I told her it meant her workplace would receive a policy-focused report if she tried to paint me as a villain to save face. I told her it meant her family would receive the truth in the same calm format if she tried to make me a monster. I told her I had learned a rule, and the rule was that you cannot argue with a person who wants drama, but you can bury them with receipts. My wife's breathing grew shallow, and she tried to pivot into bargaining, into apology, into tears that could reopen doors. She said we could talk, and she said she had been confused, and she said she did not mean it. I watched her cycle through masks like a person flipping through outfits, searching for the one that still worked on me. I told her I did not need an apology tonight. I told her I needed one statement, and I needed it in plain language. I asked her whether she intended to leave me for Nolan, and whether she had planned to do it even before tonight. My wife stared at me, and in that stare I saw the first flicker of fear that looked like real regret, because she realized the truth was now a tool I could hold. She swallowed, and then she said yes, because denying it would be useless, and she said she had planned it, because pretending otherwise would insult my intelligence. I nodded once more, and I reached for my phone, not to threaten, not to call anyone, just to document. My wife's eyes widened again, because she understood that my calm did not mean softness, it meant procedure. I told her I was going to sleep in the spare room tonight, and I told her she could sleep wherever she wanted, because I was not interested in policing her movements. I told her the first official meeting with the mediator was scheduled, and she would receive the confirmation in the morning. She asked what would happen if she refused, and I told her refusal is not a shield, it is a signal. I told her if she refused, I would proceed anyway, and the record would note she refused. I told her the world is built to reward people who show up to the process and punish people who try to dodge it. My wife stared at me like she was seeing a new person again, and she whispered that I was cruel. I almost smiled because cruelty is what liars call boundaries when boundaries stop benefiting them. I told her I was not cruel, and I was not kind, and I was simply done being edited. Then I picked up the envelope, slid the papers back inside, and sealed it again, because the truth does not need to be shouted when it is already printed. As I walked toward the hallway, I heard her behind me, breathing fast, and I knew she was already planning her next move. The problem for her was that I had planned mine first, and I had done it in ink, not emotion. The next morning arrived without mercy, the way mornings do when your life has quietly rerouted overnight. I woke in the spare room with the taste of stale air and decisions, and I listened for sounds that would tell me what version of her existed today. The house was too still at first, which meant she was either sleeping like the innocent or sitting awake, rehearsing like the guilty. I put my feet on the floor slowly, not because I was tired, but because I refused to move like a chaste man in my own home. In the hallway mirror, I looked like someone who had stopped asking for permission to breathe. That was new, and it was the kind of new that scares people who rely on old dynamics. I walked into the kitchen and found her at the table with a mug she was not drinking, staring at her phone as if it might produce a miracle. She looked up when I entered, and her eyes had that sharpened shine that usually comes after a night of crafting a narrative. It was the same face she used when she wanted to be both victim and judge, with me trapped in the middle. I did not ask how she slept, because politeness is wasted on people who are actively writing your obituary. I went straight to the fridge, pulled out water, and let the cold hit my throat like a reset button. She watched me as if she expected me to flinch, because she had always confused restraint for weakness. I set the glass down, and I kept my voice flat enough to be boring, which is a specific kind of cruelty. I told her the mediator confirmation would arrive within the hour, and I told her she could attend or refuse, but the record would reflect her choice. She laughed once, and the sound did not land the way it used to in her own head. She said I was acting like some kind of professional, like I had turned our marriage into a case file. I told her that was accurate, because feelings had proven unreliable and paperwork rarely lies. She started to say something about love and mistakes and being human, but she stopped, because she could hear how hollow it sounded in daylight. There is something about morning light that makes last night's bravado look like cheap makeup. She asked where Nolan was, as if he might have called me for instructions. I told her I did not know, and I did not care where he went to wash the taste of her off. That stung her, because she needed me to be jealous, and indifference is a locked door with no handle. She accused me of manipulating him, of putting fear in his head, of ruining the one thing that made her feel alive. I told her she had done that herself when she dragged him into our kitchen like a prop and expected applause. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, and she told me I could not stop her from leaving. I told her I was not trying to stop her from leaving, because stopping her would require wanting her to stay. The words hung there between us, and I watched the color shift in her face as she processed the loss of leverage. She had always believed she could threaten departure and get me to bargain, because I had bargained before. Now I was simply informing her what departure would cost in a world that keeps receipts. Her phone buzzed, and she pounced on it, eyes widening as she read. I could see the message reflected faintly in her pupils, and I did not need to ask what it said. Her shoulders tensed, and she swallowed hard. Then she read the line again, as if repeating it might change it. She looked up at me with anger that was almost panic, and she asked if I had contacted him. I told her I did not need to contact him, because my kitchen had already done the job for me. She shoved the phone across the table like she wanted me to see her wound. The screen showed Nolan's message in plain language, short and decisive, saying he needed space and he was not comfortable continuing this. It was the kind of message men send when they realize the dream comes with debt. She stared at me like I had written it, and I almost smiled, because she could not handle the idea that consequences could move without my direct hand. I told her that was his decision, and if she wanted someone to blame, she could start with the person who thought humiliation was a love language. Her breathing got faster, and she began to pace because she could not sit still when she was losing control. She said he was weak, and she said he was scared, and she said he was not the man she thought he was. I told her that was funny, because she had built an entire future on a man she barely knew. She stopped pacing and glared at me, and she said I was enjoying this. I told her I was enjoying clarity, which is not the same thing, but it feels worse to the person being seen. A knock came at the door, and both of us froze in that split second where the brain tries to guess what kind of trouble is arriving. I did not move quickly because urgency is a gift you give to panic, and I had stopped giving gifts. I opened the door and found my sister standing there with a grocery bag and a tight expression, the kind that says she has already heard a version of the story. My wife's face shifted immediately, softening into that practiced helplessness she used with women when she wanted allies. My sister stepped inside, looked at my wife, then looked at me, and her eyes narrowed as she read the room. She did not ask about the weather or the drive, because she had not come for small talk. She said my wife had called her late last night, crying, saying I had cornered her and embarrassed her in front of Nolan. My wife's chin lifted slightly, as if she had already won the first round. I felt something cold and clean settle in my chest, because I had predicted this, and being right is not comforting, it is simply confirming. I told my sister that my wife had announced she was leaving me for Nolan in my kitchen, with Nolan present. I told her I had not raised my voice, I had not threatened anyone, and I had not begged because I was not auditioning. I told her I had shown Nolan a set of boundaries and documents, and Nolan had chosen to leave. My wife interrupted, saying I had made Nolan feel trapped, and she said I had weaponized the law. My sister held up a hand, cutting her off, and she asked my wife one question that hit harder than any speech. She asked why Nolan was in our kitchen in the first place. My wife blinked, and the blink was longer than it should have been, because her narrative had not prepared for that angle. She said Nolan had come to talk, and she said she wanted to be honest, and she said I had taken it too far. My sister asked if my wife had told her she was pregnant, and my wife's mouth tightened as if the word itself tasted bad. She said that was private, and my sister said private choices still have public consequences when you use them like weapons. My wife turned toward me, eyes sharp, and she accused me of dragging family into it. I told her she had dragged family into it the moment she made calls after midnight to shape the story. My sister set the grocery bag down with deliberate care and looked at my wife like she was seeing her for the first time. She asked if my wife had told anyone else that I was unstable, because she had received a message from a cousin asking if I was having some kind of episode. My wife's eyes darted, and that dart was the truth trying to escape without being caught. I told my sister I expected this, because my wife always built a social buffer before she made a move. I told her she would paint me as the problem to excuse her timing, and she would do it quickly, because speed is how lies get ahead of facts. My wife scoffed and said I was paranoid, and my sister asked her to stop performing and answer directly. The room went quiet in that way that makes even the refrigerator sound accusatory. My wife's phone buzzed again, and she looked at it with fear now, not hope, like the device had become a judge. She did not show the message this time, but her shoulders sank slightly, and I could tell the world outside our house was shifting. I said nothing, because silence is the space where guilty people start filling in blanks. My sister asked, softly now, whether Nolan had a wife or a girlfriend, and my wife snapped that it did not matter. That snap told me it did matter, and it mattered in a way she did not want us to explore. My sister turned to me and asked what I planned to do, and I told her I planned to do what I said I would do. I told her I would file cleanly, I would document everything that mattered, and I would not chase my wife through emotional debates designed to exhaust me. I told her the only conversations I would have from now on would be the ones that could be summarized in a timeline. My wife laughed bitterly and said I was turning into a robot. I told her I was turning into someone she could not control, and she looked away because she hated the accuracy. My sister asked what my wife wanted, and my wife said she wanted to be happy, which is what selfish people call it when they want to escape consequences. My sister asked whether happiness required lying, humiliating, and dragging my name through other people's phones. My wife's face hardened, and she said I had always been cold and critical and emotionally unavailable. It was the oldest accusation in the book, the one cheaters throw when the current page is covered in their own ink. I watched my sister's expression, waiting to see if my wife's charm still worked. It did not. My sister said she had watched me take care of this marriage while my wife collected attention like a hobby. She said she had seen my wife turn every conflict into a performance where I was the villain. She said she did not know what happened behind closed doors, but she knew what my wife was doing right now, and it was not truth. My wife's eyes flashed with rage because losing a female ally hurt her more than losing Nolan. Nolan was desire, but my sister was credibility, and credibility is harder to replace. My wife stood up abruptly and said she would not be judged in her own home, which was rich, because she had treated my home like a stage. I corrected her without raising my voice, telling her it was not her home alone, and soon it would be a shared memory with legal boundaries. She stared at me, and I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the part where she decides whether to explode or retreat. She chose retreat, but not gracefully, because she could not resist a last attempt at control. She said she would tell everyone what kind of man I really was, and she said she would make sure people knew I was cruel. My sister shook her head and said that kind of threat only works on people who have something to hide. I told my wife that if she wanted to speak, she could speak, but she should be careful about what she invented, because invented stories tend to collapse when confronted with timestamps. That word again, timestamps, made her flinch, because she had built her life on plausible deniability, and deniability hates clocks. She walked out of the kitchen and slammed the bedroom door, and the sound echoed through the house like a cheap gavel. My sister exhaled slowly and asked me if I was okay, and I told her I was functional. I told her being okay was not the goal right now. Being consistent was the goal. I told her I needed her to ignore any late-night calls, any dramatic messages, any cries for rescue that sounded like a script. My sister nodded, and she said she would, but she wanted me to promise something too. She wanted me to promise I would not let my wife bait me into becoming the monster she wanted to announce. I promised, because I had no interest in giving my wife the satisfaction of a villain she could point at. I wanted her to face consequences that did not require me to shout, because shouting would make it about my temperament instead of her behavior. My sister asked what I would do about the pregnancy claim, and I told her I would treat it like any other claim. I would request verification through proper channels, and I would not argue with rumors. I told her that if a child existed, the child deserved procedure, not drama. My sister's expression softened, and she squeezed my shoulder. Then she left the groceries and walked out, because she understood that staying too long would turn support into clutter. After she left, the house felt larger and emptier at the same time, like it had lost its furniture and its lies. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my notebook, the one I had started using when I realized memory can be manipulated. I wrote down what happened, not as revenge, but as structure. The time my sister arrived, the accusations my wife had made, the threats my wife had voiced. I wrote them in plain language, because plain language survives lawyers and relatives. Then my phone buzzed with the mediator's confirmation, and I felt something settle into place like a bolt sliding shut. I forwarded the confirmation to my wife's email because I wanted a clean record that she received it. I included no commentary because commentary is where people hide emotional landmines. A minute later, she texted me from the bedroom, asking why I was doing this, asking if I wanted to destroy her, asking if I could not just talk like adults. I stared at the message and felt the urge to answer emotionally, because she was still my wife in the mechanical sense, and habits die slow. Instead, I typed one sentence and kept it neutral, because neutrality is the language of consequences. I told her we would talk in mediation, and that would be the safest place for both of us. I put the phone down, and I listened, and I heard her open the bedroom door quietly and step into the hallway, because she wanted to see if I would follow. I did not. I stayed seated, pen in hand, and I let the silence do what it does best. I knew she would try another move soon, because people like her cannot stand still when the narrative is slipping away. The house was quiet again, but now it was not the quiet of sleep. It was the quiet before a second strike, and I could feel it coming like a shadow crossing a clock face, slow, inevitable, and perfectly timed. By noon, the house had turned into a building with 2 occupants and 1 shared address, which is not the same thing as a home, and I could feel the difference in the way every hallway step sounded like a negotiation. She stayed behind that bedroom door for a while, as if the wood could shield her from consequences, and I stayed at the kitchen table, as if a notebook could turn chaos into something that could be filed. The mediator's confirmation sat in my sent folder like a marker in wet concrete, and I knew she had seen it, because her silence had the exact shape of someone preparing a counterattack. I cleaned the kitchen slowly, not because it needed it, but because routines are an anchor when your personal life becomes a trial with no jury yet. I wiped the counter, I stacked the cups, and I looked at the small things we had bought together, like a cheap toaster and a mismatched set of plates, and I wondered how many of our together choices had been real. I had always believed the story of us was complicated but honest, and now I was learning it had been complicated because it was dishonest. People do not drown in one wave. They drown in the moment they stop fighting the water, and I refused to stop fighting clarity. Her door opened in the late afternoon, and she emerged dressed as if she had an appointment that required respect, which told me she had already decided to perform for someone. She moved through the living room with controlled slowness, the way she did when she wanted me to look first, then speak, then reveal something emotional I could later regret. I did not look up from my notebook right away, because I wanted her to feel what it was like to be background in a room she used to dominate. She stopped near the kitchen threshold, and the air between us tightened, because she had always relied on tension to make me move. She said she had talked to a lawyer, and she said it like a threat and a shield at once. I told her that was sensible, because adults who destroy things should at least learn the correct words for the rubble. She said she would not be painted as a villain, and she said she would not allow me to control the narrative. I told her she had already painted herself the moment she laughed and called another man better, and I reminded her that I had not controlled the narrative at all, because she had been the one speaking while I had been listening. Her eyes narrowed, and she tried a new angle, one that was softer and more dangerous. She said she never meant it the way it sounded, and she said she was angry, and she said she wanted to feel valued, and she said Nolan made her feel seen. The way she said his name told me she had practiced it in the mirror, with the kind of tone she thought made betrayal look like self-discovery. I watched her hands, because hands tell the truth before faces do, and her fingers kept flexing as if she wanted to grab control from the air. I asked her one question, and I kept my voice calm enough to be insulting. I asked if Nolan was still her boss, or if he had already become her excuse for unemployment. The flicker in her eyes was fast, But it was real, and it confirmed what I had suspected since last night, because men do not stroll into a married couple's kitchen unless they believe the world bends for them. She said her job was none of my business, and she said her career had always been hers, and she said I was jealous because I could not offer her what he could. I told her jealousy would require desire, and I had moved past desire into something colder and more useful. She crossed her arms and said she would be staying elsewhere for a few nights because she needed space from my coldness. I told her she was free to go, and I added that if she removed shared property from the house, I would note it, because I was done pretending we were still playing a normal couple's game. That startled her, because she expected me to beg, and begging is the currency she knew how to spend. She said I could not stop her, and I told her again that stopping her was not my job, because my job now was documenting what she chose. She went to the closet and started pulling a suitcase out, and she made sure I could hear every zipper because she wanted me to react. I kept writing, and I wrote the time down, because details matter when someone later claims they were forced to flee. She paused in the hallway and looked back at me, and she said I was acting like a stranger. I looked up then, slowly, and I told her I was acting like the man she created when she decided to turn love into leverage. She flinched, because some truths are louder than shouting. While she packed, my phone buzzed with a notification from the joint account, the kind that hits the screen like a tap on the shoulder from reality. A charge had posted from a downtown restaurant, the kind that tries to look casual but always costs enough to be remembered. The timing was wrong for space, and the merchant name was wrong for alone, and I felt the first clean click of a new evidence piece falling into place. I did not comment, because commentary gives people warning, and warning gives them time to destroy their own footprints. I opened the banking app and took a screenshot of the merchant alert, then I noted the time and the amount in my notebook, and I did it the same way I would document a pattern at work. The act was simple, but the meaning was sharp, because she was already spending our shared money while preparing to claim she was the injured party. I stared at the transaction and imagined her laughing last night, calling Nolan better, and I realized she did not just want to leave, she wanted to leave with a bonus. I saved the screenshot to a folder I named with the date, because my feelings had learned to obey structure. She came back into the kitchen with the suitcase rolling behind her like a small, loud claim. She glanced at my phone, probably checking if I was texting someone for sympathy, and her eyes landed on the calmness on my face instead. She said she would not tolerate being monitored, and I almost laughed, because she had confused observation with control again. I told her she was not being monitored, she was being remembered, and there is a difference that scares liars more than surveillance. She said I was sick, and I told her that if she believed that, she should be careful about the things she put in writing. She went still, and she asked what I meant, and I let the pause hang long enough to make her imagination do my work. Then I told her we would be communicating through the mediator from now on, and any urgent practical needs could be sent by email, because that creates a record neither of us can edit with emotion. She scoffed and said I was treating her like an enemy, and I told her she had introduced the enemy into our kitchen, and now she was just shocked that I had recognized the intrusion. She left with the suitcase, but she lingered at the door long enough to make sure I saw her walking out. I watched without moving, because I refused to give her the satisfaction of a dramatic chase scene. The door clicked shut, and I felt a moment of silence so sharp it almost had edges. Then, less than a minute later, a message came through on my phone from a mutual friend, asking if everything was okay, because my wife had posted something vague about finally getting out and choosing peace. The speed was impressive, and the intent was obvious, because she was building her story the way a con artist builds a crowd, fast and loud. I did not reply to the friend right away, because I did not want to create a back and forth in text where nuance dies. Instead, I opened the post and took a screenshot, capturing the timestamp and the phrasing, because even vague statements can become evidence of a pre-framed narrative. I saved it beside the merchant alert screenshot, and I felt a grim calm settle in again. She had always believed the loudest person wins, but that only works in rooms without records. That evening, I drove to a small cafe I rarely visited, not because I needed coffee, but because I needed to think in a place where our furniture was not staring at me. The parking lot was half full, and the air smelled like wet pavement and burnt sugar, and I sat in my car for a moment with the engine off, listening to the quiet. Then I checked my calendar, the shared one she had insisted on months ago, because she loved the appearance of teamwork. I scrolled through the week view and noticed a conflict that had never looked important before, because I had trusted the labels. There was a block-marked mentorship dinner, scheduled on the same night as a work event she had claimed was mandatory, and the overlap was too clean to be accidental. I exported the week view as a PDF, saving it with the date and a simple file name, because simple is harder to argue with later. Then I thought about the restaurant charge again, and the pieces started to form a shape. The cover story was mentorship, the spending was shared, and the timing was sharp enough to cut. Inside the cafe, I saw a familiar face behind the counter, a woman who had served me once before and remembered my order because she had a mind that kept details. She greeted me politely, and I returned the courtesy without asking for sympathy, because sympathy is messy, and I had no interest in making a scene. I sat alone near the window and watched people move, each one carrying a private life that probably felt enormous to them, and I wondered how many of them were one sentence away from losing everything. It is strange how betrayal makes you notice the ordinary world again, because the ordinary world keeps going without caring. While I waited, my phone buzzed with another message, this time from my sister, asking if my wife had left and whether I was safe. I replied with a short, clear sentence, telling her my wife had left voluntarily and that I was fine, because I needed my sister to have a clean line she could repeat if someone tried to twist the story. Then I opened my email and saw a new message from the mediator's office, confirming the first session time and requesting basic financial documents. The practical nature of it felt almost comforting, like a lifeline thrown by bureaucracy. I forwarded the mediator's message to my wife's email again, and I did it without commentary, because commentary invites argument. Then I printed the email at the cafe's small business center, because holding paper makes things feel real in a way screens do not. I tucked the printout into a folder in my car, because I was already building the spine of a case, and spines matter when something heavy is coming. As I drove home, the sky was dark, and the headlights of other cars looked like brief, indifferent stares. When I pulled into the driveway, a car was already parked nearby, one I did not recognize, and my first instinct was to assume nothing and observe. I walked up the path calmly, keys in hand, and I noticed a small envelope taped to my door, plain and unmarked, except for my name written in neat block letters. The handwriting looked practiced, not rushed, and that detail alone raised my pulse slightly. I removed the envelope carefully and stepped inside, locking the door behind me with deliberate slowness. I stood under the hallway light and opened the envelope, and inside was a single printed page, no signature, no greeting, just a statement that someone had concerns about my behavior and that I should seek help before I hurt someone. The wording was careful, like it had been written by someone who knew what to imply without committing to a lie that could be proven. My stomach tightened, not from fear of the note itself, but from the realization that she was escalating fast, and she had chosen the oldest tactic in the book: paint him unstable, so nobody trusts his version. I took a photo of the note on the hallway table with the timestamp visible, then I placed it in a clear sleeve from the office supplies drawer, because the irony was perfect, and I did not waste it. I wrote down the time I found it, and I wrote down the car description outside, because patterns begin with small details. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of what she was trying to build, because this was no longer just a messy breakup. This was a narrative war, and she had decided she would rather destroy me than admit she had destroyed us. My phone buzzed again, and the screen showed an unknown number, calling twice in a row like an emergency. I let it ring out because emergencies have names, and this one did not. Then a voicemail appeared, and I listened to it with my face still, because I had learned that calm is armor. The voice was a man's voice, strained and low, and he said my name once. Then he said he needed to talk, and he said it was about my wife and Nolan, and he said it could not wait. He did not say who he was, but the urgency sounded real, and the fear underneath it sounded like someone who had seen the wrong side of this story. I stared at the voicemail screen, feeling the night tighten around my house again, and I realized I was about to learn a piece of the truth she could not control anymore. I listened to the voicemail twice more, not because I enjoyed pain, but because details hide inside tone and pacing. The man sounded like someone who had rehearsed courage all day and still failed the audition. He said my name once, then he mentioned my wife and Nolan like they were explosives, and he left the rest hanging. I did not call back immediately, because the first move in a messy story is usually a test. Instead, I saved a screenshot of the voicemail screen with the timestamp visible. Then I wrote the number down in my notebook, because I was done trusting memory to behave under stress. I stepped to the front window and looked at the street again, taking in the unknown car's position and the empty sidewalk around it. Nothing moved, which did not make me feel safe. It made me feel staged. I took a photo through the glass, capturing the car and its license plate as cleanly as I could. Then I locked the image away in the same folder as the note. My house suddenly felt like a set where someone else controlled the lights, and I hated that feeling more than I hated the betrayal itself. Betrayal at least admits it exists. Manipulation pretends it is concern. I called the number back from the kitchen, with my back to the wall and my eyes on the door. It rang twice, then clicked into a breathy silence that sounded like a hand over a microphone. When the man spoke, he did not greet me politely, and he did not pretend this was casual. He said he could not talk long, and he said he had left that voicemail because he did not know what else to do. He told me his name was Evan, and he told me he worked in the same office tower as Nolan, but not for Nolan. He said he had seen something that made his stomach turn, and he said my wife's name came up in a conversation that sounded like strategy, not romance. I asked him where he was calling from, because I needed his reality to have coordinates. He said he was parked a few blocks away, and he said he could not come to my house because he did not want to be seen near it. That matched the unknown car outside too neatly, and it made my nerves sharpen. I did not accuse him, because accusation is a gift you cannot take back. I asked him what he wanted, and I kept my voice level enough to make it hard to perform against. He said he wanted to hand me something, and he said he wanted it out of his life. He said he was not my friend and he did not want to become involved. But he also said he could not stand the idea of watching another man get set on fire while everyone clapped. That line stayed with me because it sounded less like drama and more like guilt. I told him to meet me somewhere public with cameras that nobody had to favor me to access. I chose a late-night diner near a busy intersection, the kind of place where staff remember faces and the parking lot stays bright. He agreed quickly, which made him either honest or desperate, and both can be dangerous. I told him I would be there in 20 minutes, and I told him I would not come alone if he tried anything foolish. I did not mention that I had not planned to bring anyone, because bluffing is a small sin when the alternative is walking into a trap unarmed by awareness. Before I left, I slipped the note back into its sleeve and put it in my folder. Then I took my keys and checked the locks twice, because repetition is comfort when trust is gone. On the drive over, I kept the radio off because sound distracts, and I had no spare attention to donate. The streets looked normal, which only emphasized how abnormal my life had become. Families in warm cars, people laughing at crosswalks, a couple carrying groceries like they were the only problem in the world. I parked under the diner's front lights, in a spot facing the entrance, and I stayed in the car long enough to watch who came and went. I checked the time, wrote it down, and then walked in with the steady pace of a man who still owned his spine. Inside, the diner smelled like old coffee and fried food, and the air held the soft hum of someone else's arguments. I chose a booth with a clear view of the door and the counter, because I had learned that comfort is a privilege for people whose lives are not being edited by enemies. I ordered something simple, paid immediately, and took the receipt, because I had started collecting reality like it was a currency that could not be counterfeited. When the waitress walked away, I placed my phone face down and kept my hands visible, because I had no interest in looking like the unstable man someone was trying to create. Evan arrived 5 minutes late, and he looked like a man who had not slept well since he learned a secret. He was in his early 30s, dressed like someone who wanted to be invisible in office corridors, and his eyes kept shifting as if expecting a familiar face to step into the doorway. He slid into the booth across from me without asking, and his shoulders stayed high, like his body was still trying to climb away. I did not greet him warmly. Warmth creates illusion. I nodded once and waited. He started talking too fast, so I slowed him down with one question at a time. He told me he worked in event operations for the building, which meant he dealt with conference rooms, access requests, vendor deliveries, and last-minute changes that always involved someone trying to look important. He said Nolan was a frequent name on those requests, because Nolan loved private meetings and confidential setups. Evan said he did not work for Nolan, but he had handled a few logistics items that came from Nolan's office, and he had seen patterns. He said my wife's name had appeared on a printed request sheet by mistake, and that mistake had made him pay attention. I asked him what sheet, and he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded page, keeping it low. He did not shove it at me dramatically, and that restraint made me trust him more than any sob story could. He unfolded it carefully and slid it across the table. It was a simple internal request form for a small meeting room reservation, with 2 names listed under attendees, and the date had been circled in pen. One of the names was Nolan's, and the other was my wife's. The meeting title was generic, something like mentorship review, but the room number and time matched the gap in her calendar that never made sense. I did not react outwardly, because reactions are oxygen for manipulators, and I was starving them on purpose. I looked at the paper, then I looked at Evan, and I asked him why he printed it. He said it had been emailed to him as part of a batch, and he printed it automatically because he had been trained to keep paper backups for room setups. He said he had kept the copy because later that day, he heard Nolan in a corridor speaking to someone about my wife in a tone that did not sound affectionate. He said Nolan had joked that she was useful and that her husband was quiet, which made her easy to manage until the timing was right. That word, manage, made my jaw tighten, because it was not the language of love. I asked Evan who Nolan was talking to, and Evan said he did not see the other person clearly, but he recognized the voice as someone from HR, a woman who handled terminations like paperwork. Evan said Nolan sounded confident, like he had done this kind of thing before, and he said the HR voice sounded amused, not concerned. He told me the part that made him call me was this. Nolan had said my wife was already preparing a narrative that I was unstable, and that it would help if my wife left first and made it public. I stared at the paper again, and I felt the chessboard beneath the marriage. I had thought this was a simple betrayal with a cruel laugh in my kitchen, and now I was seeing the larger machinery behind it. This did not mean my wife was innocent, because she had still chosen it, and she had still spoken those words to my face. It meant she had joined forces with people who treated lives like office projects. I asked Evan if he had proof of the corridor conversation, and he shook his head quickly, almost panicked, as if he feared I would demand something illegal. I told him I did not want recordings, and I did not want him to break policies for me. I told him I wanted only what he already had lawfully, because the truth does not need crime to be effective. He exhaled, and some of the tension left his shoulders, as if he had been waiting for me to ask him to become a villain too. He said he also had an email header on his phone from that meeting request, showing the date and the sender line, but he had not forwarded it because he did not want a digital trail that pointed at him. I asked him to show it to me, and I kept my hands off his device because boundaries matter when you are building a case. He pulled up the email and angled it so I could read the header lines, and I took a photo of his screen with my phone, capturing only the sender, subject line, and timestamp, not any private content beyond that. He watched me carefully while I did it, like he was deciding whether I was a decent man or just a quieter monster. I kept my face neutral because decency often looks boring in the moment. I asked him one more thing, and I made it simple enough that he could answer without inventing. I asked him if he had seen my wife and Nolan together in the building outside normal hours. Evan hesitated. Then he said he had, once, near a conference room corridor, when most lights were off and only security lighting remained. He said they had been walking too close, and he said my wife's posture looked like someone who had already chosen to belong. He said they stopped when they noticed him, and Nolan gave him a friendly nod like a king acknowledging a servant. Evan said my wife looked away and smiled at the floor, and that detail hurt more than a slap. I paid for Evan's coffee without asking, because I did not want any argument about favors. I told him he could leave first, and I told him that if anyone asked, he had met me to discuss a scheduling complaint for the building, because that sounded plausible and boring. He nodded with gratitude that he tried to hide, and he slipped out quickly, shoulders still tense, eyes scanning the door. I waited a full 5 minutes after he left, watching the entrance, watching the parking lot through the windows, making sure I was not walking into a follow-up move. When I finally stepped outside, the cold air hit my face like a reset button. I walked to my car and checked my mirrors before I got in. Then I sat for a minute and reviewed what I had gained. A meeting request form with names and date, a photo of an email header proving it existed, and a witness willing to describe what he saw if he had to, even if he hated the idea. It was household level in the sense that it was not secret surveillance or hacking. It was simply the paper trail of people who assumed nobody would hold them to it. The irony was perfect, because the people who rely on systems always forget systems also create records. On the drive home, I saw the unknown car again, farther down the street, as if it had relocated to keep watching. I did not chase it, because chasing is a performance, and performances are how people get framed. Instead, I drove past my own house and looped the block, giving myself a wider view of who might be parked nearby. The car's headlights flicked on, as if someone had noticed me noticing, and it pulled away smoothly, not fast, which told me this was not panic. This was confidence. I took a quick photo as it turned, catching the plate again, and then I drove home with a steady pulse that did not need permission to beat. Inside, the house was quiet, but the quiet now felt like a controlled space again, not a cage. I laid the meeting request form on the kitchen table, photographed it next to that day's date written in my notebook, and then slid it into a sleeve with the note. I placed the sleeves into the folder and labeled it with a simple title: Timeline. I did not call my wife because calling would give her the chance to shape the moment with tears or rage. I did not text her because text becomes a battlefield of selective screenshots. I opened my laptop and drafted a short email to the mediator, stating that new relevant information had surfaced about scheduling and workplace overlap, and that I would bring documentation to the first session. Then I did something else, something that felt like turning a key in a lock. I opened the joint account settings and initiated a civil request to limit discretionary spending on my own cards, not to punish her, but to stop the bleeding. I did not freeze everything, because dramatic moves invite dramatic accusations. I simply set a boundary that could be justified as responsible, and I saved the confirmation screen. My life had become a room where every action needed a reason that would survive cross-examination, and I was learning to live that way without turning bitter. As I shut the laptop, my phone buzzed again, and this time the message was from my wife. It was short and written like an announcement to an audience, not a note to a husband. She said she needed to come by tomorrow to get the rest of her things, and she said she would bring someone with her For safety. The phrase "for safety" was the whole point, because it was bait for the narrative she was building. I did not answer immediately. I stared at the screen, imagining her arriving with Nolan or someone from her circle, trying to make me look dangerous in my own kitchen. I opened my notes, and I wrote one line under tomorrow's date. She plans witnesses. Then I looked at the folder on my table, and I realized I could let her bring whoever she wanted because I was done fearing an audience, and I knew exactly where I wanted the next audience to be. I did not answer her message that night because any response would become a prop in her hands. I set the phone down, washed my glass, and kept moving through the kitchen like routine still owned this house. The folder on the table looked ordinary, which was the point, because ordinary objects are the ones people forget to fear. I slept in short blocks, waking whenever a car passed, and each time I woke, I reminded myself that calm is not weakness, it is control. In the morning, I sent one text, as dull as a parking receipt, because dull messages leave little room for theater. I wrote that she could come at noon, that the door would be open, and that she could take only what was hers. I added that I would not be alone either, because symmetry discourages games. I did not mention names because names invite negotiation, and I was done negotiating with someone who had already laughed while leaving. I called my neighbor across the street, an older man named Grant, who had lived there longer than I had been married. Grant did not like drama, which meant he noticed it early and remembered it accurately. I told him I needed him as a neutral witness for a pickup of belongings, nothing more, and I asked if he would sit on my porch and read his newspaper at noon. He paused like he was weighing whether I deserved help. Then he agreed in the simple voice of a man who had seen enough life to recognize a bad pattern. I thanked him, and I kept my tone steady, because gratitude should not sound like desperation. After that, I drove to the leasing office of our apartment building, not to beg, but to document boundaries. The office manager knew my name because I paid on time and I never caused noise complaints, which is a rare romance in rental life. I asked for a printout of our lease summary and the policy line about unauthorized occupants and security escort rules. I kept my request polite and practical, like I was planning a routine move, and she handed me the pages without suspicion. I photographed the printout beside the office calendar on the wall, then I slipped it into my folder because policies have a way of becoming weapons when people want to paint you as unstable. When I got home, I placed my phone on the counter and turned on the simple voice memo app, not to spy, but to keep my own memory clean. I did not record anyone in secret, and I did not hide the device, because secretive behavior is the soil where accusations grow. I wanted a record of my own words and my own choices, in case someone later claimed I screamed, threatened, or begged. If she wanted to manufacture a story, she would have to fight against something steadier than her performance. Noon arrived like a slow-moving storm, with the air too bright and the street too quiet. Grant was already outside, sitting on his porch with a newspaper open and his eyes watching over the top edge. A car pulled up, and my wife stepped out, wearing the kind of coat she used to wear to impress strangers, not to comfort a spouse. Nolan came around the other side, because of course he did, carrying himself like he belonged on my sidewalk. He smiled as if the world had been waiting for him, and that smile was the same kind of arrogance I had heard in Evan's story. My wife did not greet me like someone who once shared a bed and a bank account. She walked up the path with her chin lifted, like a plaintiff arriving at court, and she glanced at Grant with a sharp flicker of irritation. Nolan followed half a step behind, as if he was both escort and trophy, which is a tiring role for any man who thinks he is powerful. I opened the door and stood to the side, leaving the threshold empty like a neutral zone. I did not offer them coffee, because hospitality is for people who do not treat your life like a joke. They entered, and my wife immediately scanned the room, looking for signs of how I had reacted since she left. She wanted emptiness, broken glass, or evidence of spiraling, and she found none. The living room was clean, the dishes were washed, and the folder on the table was closed. Nolan's eyes lingered on that folder. Then he looked at me with an expression that pretended curiosity but carried threat underneath. He began to speak like someone launching a speech, but I cut the moment short by pointing toward the bedroom and the hall closet. I told my wife to take her clothes and personal items first, then her toiletries, then anything that had her name on it. I said it clearly and evenly, the way a man reads a checklist when he does not want to miss a step. She scoffed, because scoffing is easier than admitting she was surprised I did not crumble. Nolan kept his hands in his pockets and wandered a few steps, as if inspecting a property he expected to acquire. Grant's chair creaked outside as he adjusted his posture, and that small sound grounded me more than any pep talk could. My wife went to the bedroom, and Nolan followed without asking. I did not block him, because blocking him would create the scene they came to film in their minds. Instead, I walked to the kitchen table, opened my folder, and slid a single page onto the surface, face down. It was the meeting request form, and the paper itself felt like a quiet, loaded question. I did not call anyone because calls can be twisted. I simply waited and listened to the muffled noises of drawers opening and hangers shifting. When they returned, my wife carried a box, and Nolan carried nothing, because Nolan believed his presence was contribution. My wife glanced at the page on the table and her eyes narrowed, sensing that something had changed in the air. Nolan glanced too, and his smile thinned at the corners, as if he disliked paper more than conflict. He asked what that was, in a voice that tried to sound casual, but the question landed too quickly to be casual. I told him it was nothing he needed to worry about if he had nothing to hide. My wife laughed again, because laughter is her shield, and she said I was being dramatic. She said I could not accept being left, and she said Nolan was better in every way that mattered. It was the same line she had used before, polished like a coin she liked to spend. Nolan leaned on the counter and watched me, waiting for anger, waiting for begging, waiting for proof that he could push a button and make me bleed. I smiled, not because I felt joy, but because I had stopped rewarding cruelty with pain. I asked Nolan if he enjoyed mentorship reviews, and I said the words like I was asking about weather. His eyebrows lifted for a fraction of a second, and that fraction mattered more than any denial he could offer. My wife's laughter hit a strange note, then softened into caution, and her hands tightened around the box. Nolan said he did not know what I was talking about, which is what men say when they hope confusion will protect them. I flipped the page over and slid it across the table until it stopped near his hand. The paper did not accuse him loudly, it simply existed. It showed a date, a room number, and two names that did not belong together in a professional setting. Nolan's eyes moved over it fast, then he looked up and tried to steady his expression, but his jaw flexed like someone biting down on a mistake. My wife leaned in and read it too, and the color drained from her face in a way that her makeup could not hide. She started to speak, then stopped, because the paper gave her no good entry point. Nolan picked up the form, scanned it again, and then set it down as if the table had become contaminated. He said it was meaningless, and he said anyone could write a name on a form. I nodded slowly, because he was right in the narrow sense that paper can be forged. But he was wrong in the larger sense that patterns do not forge themselves. I told him I had the email header that sent it, and I told him I had a witness who handled the logistics, and I told him I had no interest in shouting about it in my living room. I said it calmly, and that calm robbed him of his favorite opponent. My wife tried a new angle because she is practiced at turning corners when the road collapses. She said Nolan was helping her, that she needed support, that she had felt lonely, that I had been distant. She said everything except the truth, which was that she had enjoyed the feeling of replacing me. Nolan stared at me like he was searching for a crack. Then he stepped closer, as if physical proximity could restore his authority. He said I should let it go, and he said I should move on, and he said he did not want trouble. I told him he was in my house, and he had already brought trouble. I said the difference was that I now controlled where it landed. Nolan's eyes flicked toward the front window, toward Grant's porch, and I watched him register the witness outside. My wife followed his gaze, and her posture shifted, because she realized her safety escort had become my credibility shield. For a brief moment, none of us spoke, and the silence felt like a courthouse hallway where everyone is waiting for a door to open. My wife set her box down too hard, and the sound was sharp enough to feel like a crack in glass. She asked what I wanted, and the question came out thinner than she intended. I told her I wanted the truth on paper, not in the air, because air changes shape when people lie. I told her we were going to mediation, and I told her I would bring documentation of timelines and spending and cover stories. I said I was not trying to ruin her life, but I was no longer willing to let her ruin mine. Nolan scoffed again, but it sounded forced, like a man laughing at his own funeral. My wife tried to reclaim control by threatening me with reputation, because reputation is her chosen battlefield. She said people would believe her over me, and she said Nolan had connections, and she said I could not win against them. I nodded as if I agreed. Then I asked one question, simple enough to survive any retelling. I asked why she needed Nolan in my house, if he was just someone better, and why she needed a witness, if she was not planning to accuse me of something. Her mouth opened, then closed, because she realized the logic had trapped her without shouting. Nolan stepped between us slightly, a gesture that tried to look protective but felt like ownership. He said he would handle this, and he told my wife they should leave. She hesitated, because leaving without victory was not how she liked endings. I told her she could take the rest of her things, but Nolan would not walk deeper into my home again. I said it like a boundary, not a threat, and I pointed toward the door with my open hand. Nolan's eyes sharpened, and for a second I thought he might push for a physical moment, because bullies love scenes. Instead, he took a step back and put a careful smile on his face, because he understood witnesses better than emotions. My wife grabbed the box again, and she moved toward the door with a stiff posture that screamed humiliation. At the threshold she turned and tried one last laugh, but it broke halfway through and became a bitter sound. She said I was pathetic, and she said I would die alone, and she said Nolan was the only real man she had ever wanted. Nolan did not join the insult, because he could feel the paper burning a hole in his confidence. They left, and Grant watched them go with the calm, judging eyes of a man who had raised children and buried friends. I stepped onto the porch and thanked him, and he nodded once. Then he said, in a low voice, that he had seen couples like this before. He said the person who performs cruelty in public always cries first when the crowd turns. I did not reply with wisdom, because I was not trying to be wise, I was trying to be accurate. I went back inside and locked the door. Then I placed the meeting form back in the folder like it was a chess piece returned to its square. My phone buzzed again within minutes, and the message was from my wife, now written in a different tone. She said I had no right to drag Nolan into our marriage. She said the form meant nothing. She said she would tell people I was stalking her, and she said she would get a lawyer to protect her. I did not answer with panic, because panic is what she wanted to screenshot. I opened my notes and wrote down her exact words, then I took a screenshot of the message with the time visible, and I saved it under a folder labeled Cover Story. That night I received an email from the mediator confirming the date and time of our first session. I saved the confirmation and printed it, because paper cannot be deleted with a trembling finger. I organized my folder into sections, each section simple enough that a neutral person could follow it without my emotions guiding them. Timeline, financial, messages, policies, and witness. The folder was not revenge. It was structure, and structure is what liars fear most. Before I went to bed, I opened the shared calendar on our household account, not to invade, but to export what I already had access to as a spouse. I saved the weak view as a PDF, highlighting the blank gaps where she claimed to be working late and where Nolan's meeting requests conveniently lived. I did not accuse her in that PDF, I simply preserved it, because tomorrow she could delete events and call me paranoid. I signed the back of the printout with the date, then placed it in a clear sleeve because I had learned that time-stamped dullness beats dramatic anger every time. As I turned off the light, I realized the thing that had shifted inside me. I was no longer waiting for her to regret what she did, because regret can be an act too. I was building a sequence of small truths that would force the world to see what she had been laughing about. I knew Nolan would not tolerate exposure inside systems he thought he controlled, and I knew my wife would not tolerate being seen as replaceable in the very crowd she wanted to impress. The only question left was which public room would hold them still long enough for silence to do its work. And as I lay there in the dark, hearing the building settle around me, I chose the room, and I chose the date. By the time the mediation date arrived, the building felt different, like every hallway knew my name and had opinions about it. I kept my face neutral, my clothes plain, and my folder clean, because drama feeds on decoration and I was starving it on purpose. The night before the session, my wife sent another string of messages that swung between rage and sweetness, and each one sounded like a rehearsal for an audience she had not met yet. I did not answer because replies become ladders for liars, and I had stopped building ladders for her climb. In the morning, I parked 2 blocks away from the mediation office, not to hide, but to make sure my head was quiet when I walked in. I arrived early enough to sit alone, and I chose a chair where the receptionist could see me clearly, because visibility prevents later stories about intimidation. The waiting room smelled like cheap coffee and copied paper, which felt appropriate, because divorce is mostly paperwork pretending to be emotion. When my wife arrived, she did not come alone, and she did not bring Nolan, because Nolan avoided rooms where rules were written down. She brought a lawyer with a sharp suit and a softer smile, and she brought that old confidence that says, the world will believe her first. The mediator introduced herself with practiced calm, and she reminded us that the room was for problem-solving, not punishment. I nodded once because I had no interest in speeches, and because my method was quiet proof, not loud pain. My wife spoke first, and she painted a picture where I was cold, distant, and jealous, which is the classic portrait a person uses when they want betrayal to look like self-defense. She said I was controlling, and she said I watched her too closely, and she said my obsession with Nolan was proof I had always been insecure. Her lawyer added words like boundaries and emotional safety, and they said them the way people say prayers, hoping the rhythm will substitute for facts. When it was my turn, I kept my voice steady and my sentences ordinary, because ordinary language is harder to weaponize. I said I was not here to argue feelings, and I said I was here to set terms that protected both parties and prevented escalating conflict. I slid one document across the table, face down at first, then turned it over gently, like I was showing a receipt to a cashier. It was the same meeting form Nolan had touched in my kitchen, and this time it had company letterhead and an email header attached behind it. The mediator's eyes moved slowly, and my wife's eyes moved fast, and speed always tells you who is afraid. My wife tried to laugh, but the sound came out thin and wrong, like a cracked glass trying to pretend it was still useful. She said it proved nothing, and her lawyer said it could be misinterpreted, and then they both switched to a different tactic without admitting the first one failed. They claimed Nolan was simply a professional contact, and they claimed my wife's frustration with me had nothing to do with another man, and they said my focus on the boss was harassment. I waited until the words finished, then I placed a second page down, which was a calendar export from our shared account with 2 overlapping blocks highlighted by my own hand. I did not accuse her of anything on the page, because accusation is not evidence, and I wanted the paper to do the talking without my mouth. The mediator asked for clarity, and I gave it in the simplest shape possible, because the truth does not need ornament to cut. I said my wife told me she was leaving because she found someone better, and the someone she named was Nolan, which was the first time she had spoken his name in our marriage. I said Nolan later walked into our kitchen like he belonged there, and I said I had a neutral neighbor witness who watched their arrival and their departure. My wife's lawyer tried to interrupt, but the mediator held up a hand, and I watched my wife flinch at the gesture like she was not used to being paused. I offered to provide the witness name and a one-sentence statement, and I offered it the way a man offers a spare tire, not the way a man throws a brick. My wife's face tightened, and she claimed Nolan only came because she feared I would react badly. The mediator asked why she feared that, and my wife stumbled, because she had been rehearsing for a different kind of listener. She said I had been unpredictable, then she said I had moods, then she said I went quiet, and she said it like quiet was violence. I kept my posture relaxed and my hands visible on the table, because I wanted the room to feel the difference between her claims and my reality. When the mediator asked if there were any police reports or documented incidents, my wife's lawyer hesitated, then said there were none. The room grew slightly colder, not because the air changed, but because the story lost its oxygen. I slid one more document forward, and this one was not about Nolan, which was the part my wife did not expect. It was a printed screenshot of her recent messages threatening to tell people I was stalking her, with the timestamp visible and the tone unmistakable. I said I was not presenting it to shame her, and I said I was presenting it to explain why I wanted communication rules in writing. I asked for a no-harassment clause, a clear schedule for property pickup, and a direct instruction that any allegations be made through counsel, not through late-night texts. The mediator nodded slowly, and I saw the first crack in my wife's confidence, because she realized I was building a record that her charm could not erase. The session ended with temporary agreements, and my wife left the building fast, like she wanted the hallway to forget she had been there. Her lawyer stayed behind for an extra minute to ask if I intended to contact my wife's workplace, and the question was shaped like a warning wrapped in politeness. I told her I intended to follow the law and protect my reputation, and I said I would not make public claims without documentation, because I was not interested in a smear war. The lawyer studied me like she was trying to decide whether I was bluffing, and then she left without shaking my hand. As I walked out, the receptionist looked up and gave me a small, careful nod, and that nod felt like a quiet verdict. 2 hours later, my wife posted a smiling photo on social media with a caption about new beginnings, and she tagged a restaurant that I recognized as expensive and performative. I did not comment, because comment sections are a swamp, and I had learned to stay on dry ground. Instead, I saved the public post permalink screenshot with the date stamp, and I placed it behind the other papers in my folder. That post mattered because it showed timing, and timing is what liars struggle to keep consistent when pressure rises. Within the same afternoon, a friend of hers unfollowed her, then followed again, which told me someone was watching the mess but still afraid to choose a side. The next piece of pressure came from the bank, and it arrived in the language bank's love, which is bland and fatal. A merchant alert popped up on my phone from our shared account, showing a purchase that did not match our usual pattern. The amount was not enormous, but the location mattered and the time mattered, and the fact that she used the joint account after claiming she was starting fresh mattered most. I went to the branch the following day, not to accuse anyone, but to request a transaction summary for my own records, because the account was in my name as well. The clerk printed a single page, and I photographed the printout at the counter with the bank logo visible, because later, the simple things become the strongest anchors. I did not freeze the account immediately, because sudden moves create a narrative of financial abuse, and I was not giving her that weapon. Instead, I filed a civil request to separate discretionary spending, and I kept the request narrow and practical, focusing on future purchases rather than punishment for past ones. The confirmation email came within minutes, and I saved it to the same folder as the mediation documents because everything now was a timeline, not a fight. My wife texted an hour later asking why her card had a problem, and her message carried that familiar laugh underneath, like she assumed I was too soft to act. I replied once, in the calmest language possible, saying the account rules were changing through proper channels, and that her lawyer could contact mine if she needed details. I kept the message short enough to be clean, but long enough to be unmistakably composed. That night, my wife called me, and when I did not pick up, she left a voice message that sounded rehearsed and sweet. She said she wanted peace, and she said she missed the good parts, and she said we could be mature if I stopped attacking Nolan. It was a better performance than her texts, and that told me someone had coached her, possibly a friend, possibly Nolan, possibly both. I saved a screenshot of the voice message timestamp without listening to it twice because repetition makes you vulnerable to manipulation. Then I wrote one line in my ledger that captured the pattern, because patterns matter more than any single moment. Sweetness follows pressure, and threats follow silence. The next morning, I received an email from a colleague of mine who had always been friendly but never intimate, and his tone was careful in a way that made my stomach tighten. He said he had heard something, and he asked if I was okay, and he did not say what the something was, which meant the rumor already had multiple shapes. I thanked him and told him I was handling a private matter through proper channels, and I said I appreciated his concern. After I sent it, I sat still for a full minute, because I realized my wife had moved the battlefield from my home to my name. She had always loved an audience, and now she was building one behind my back. I decided to stop treating her like a spouse and start treating her like a story that needed to be constrained by facts. I drafted a single-page timeline that listed dates, locations, and documents, without adjectives or insults, and I kept every line tied to something I could show. I printed it, signed the back, and placed it in a clear sleeve, because I wanted the physicality of it to feel official without pretending it was. Then, I wrote a civil demand letter through my attorney, not to threaten, but to set boundaries around defamation and harassment, and to make it clear that allegations would have consequences if they were knowingly false. The letter did not mention revenge, it mentioned civility, and that was the cruelest word to a person who wanted drama. Late that afternoon, Grant knocked on my door, and his face looked like it does when older men decide they have seen enough to speak. He said Nolan had been back on the street the previous night, sitting in his car, watching the building like he was waiting for a scene. Grant said he did not know if it meant anything, but he said he did not like it. I thanked him, and I asked him for nothing more than a one-sentence summary of what he saw, because I was not building a case out of paranoia. He wrote the sentence on a piece of paper with shaky but deliberate handwriting, and he signed it with the date, and that paper felt heavier than it should have. I walked into my kitchen after he left, and I stared at the empty space where my wife used to stand when she pretended to be kind. I realized Nolan's confidence had shifted, and the shift was important, because men like him only hover when they feel control slipping. If he was watching my building, he was worried about what I might do next, and worry makes people reckless. I opened my folder and placed Grant's witness line behind the timeline sleeve, then I closed the folder and felt the click of the clasp like a quiet promise. I was not going to chase them, but I was going to choose a room where they could not run. The invitation arrived that evening, not to my wife, but to me, because the world still assumed we were a unit. It was a corporate event announcement for a company-sponsored community fundraiser with a list of attendees and a program schedule, and Nolan's name sat near the top as a featured speaker. The location was public, the format was structured, and the crowd would be full of people who cared about appearances more than truth. I stared at the screen for a long time, then I saved the RSVP list screenshot with the date stamp and slid my phone into my pocket. I finally understood why Nolan had walked into my kitchen with that smug face, because he thought every room belonged to him. I locked my door, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark long enough to hear my own breathing settle. My wife wanted me to explode in private, because private explosions are easy to deny, and they make great stories. Nolan wanted me to swing first, because then he could call security and look righteous. I was not giving either of them what they wanted. I was going to bring one page, one timeline, and one calm question into Nolan's best room, and I was going to let the crowd watch their confidence disappear in real time. And as I stood up to put the folder back into its place, my phone buzzed again with a message from my wife that sounded like a threat dressed as concern, and I knew the countdown had already started. Day started the way most disasters do, with everything looking normal enough to fool strangers. I spent the afternoon moving slowly through my apartment, checking the same folder twice, making sure every page was in the correct order, because order is the only kind of comfort a man gets when he is walking into a room designed to swallow him. I dressed like someone who belonged anywhere without being noticed, which meant nothing flashy, nothing casual, nothing that could be turned into a headline if a camera caught it. I ate something small, not because I was hungry, but because adrenaline makes smart men forget basic maintenance, and I refused to let my body become another weakness my wife could narrate. An hour before the fundraiser, I drove past the venue once without stopping, because I wanted to see the flow of arrivals and the layout of exits. The building was a renovated historic hall that smelled like money in disguise, with a wide front stairway and a glass entry that turned every guest into a silhouette for everyone to judge. I parked in a lot that required a short walk, because walking forces your thoughts into a single line, and I needed my thoughts to stop roaming. When I reached the front, I saw staff in matching uniforms, a sponsor banner stretched across the doorway, and a volunteer table set up like a smiling gatekeeper. The whole scene was built to look clean, and I knew that clean is exactly where dirt hides best. Inside, the room was brighter than it needed to be, and the lights were placed to flatter faces and erase shadows. People stood in clusters, holding drinks they barely tasted, laughing at jokes that were mostly social signals, and I watched them the way a patient man watches a crowded intersection. I spotted Nolan quickly, because men like him are magnets for attention, and attention is the one thing they never share. He wore a suit that fit too perfectly, and he moved like he assumed the floor existed for him alone. My wife was near him, not close enough to look guilty at first glance, but close enough that any honest person would feel the connection before they could explain it. I did not walk straight toward them, because direct movement is what predators expect from prey. I went to the volunteer table first, signed in politely, and accepted the small printed program like it was just another charity night for decent people. My hands stayed steady while my mind did its quiet work, because the whole point of this was never to scream, it was to document. When I glanced at the program, I saw Nolan's name listed in bold, and beneath it, the title of his talk, which sounded like a lecture about leadership and integrity. That irony tasted like metal, and I swallowed it without letting my face show the flavor. As I moved deeper into the room, I recognized the kind of crowd Nolan needed, which was a crowd that loved reputations more than reality. There were board members, mid-level executives, HR people with careful smiles, and local donors who treated generosity like a brand. I caught a glimpse of the event coordinator, a woman with a headset and a clipboard, and I stored her in my mind as the kind of person who mattered when minutes were typed. A good night for Nolan was not about romance, it was about witness control, because witnesses are the only thing that turns behavior into consequence. My wife saw me before Nolan did, because she was always watching for the angle that made her look safest. Her face shifted quickly, and she moved her mouth as if she was speaking to someone, then stopped, as if she remembered that microphones can exist anywhere. She walked toward me with an expression that tried to balance surprise and superiority, like she still believed she could choose the tone of every scene. I kept my posture neutral, and I gave her the same polite acknowledgement I would give a stranger who had once been a friend. The absence of warmth bothered her more than any insult would have, because warmth is something she could weaponize, while indifference left her with nothing to hold. Nolan finally noticed me, and his eyes narrowed in that careful way that tells you he knows exactly what he did. He did not approach immediately, because a public room changes a man's courage into calculation. He leaned slightly toward my wife, and I watched the subtle movement of his hand, the way he guided her without appearing to touch her too much. The gesture was small, but small gestures are where people reveal their real hierarchy, and in that moment, my wife looked less like a partner and more like a project. I did not confront either of them, because confrontation was not the engine tonight. Instead, I moved toward the far side of the room where the sponsor wall stood, and I took a slow look at the photo area, because events like this always create images that become evidence later. A photographer was adjusting his camera, and I saw a preview screen flicker as he tested his settings. The screen showed faces in sharp detail, which meant timestamps and metadata would exist somewhere, even if I never touched them. I made a mental note of the photographer's name on his badge, because names are doorways when you need a neutral confirmation later. The first time Nolan spoke that night, it was into a small circle of donors, and his voice carried the calm confidence of a man who thinks policy is a weapon he owns. People nodded, laughed softly, and leaned closer when he leaned in, because they wanted to be chosen by his attention. My wife stood slightly behind him, smiling at the right moments, and I felt the old familiar sting of seeing her perform for someone else. I kept my face still and my breathing controlled, because my pride was not the goal, and my goal was not emotional closure. It was structural consequence. As the event coordinator called for guests to move toward the seating area, I followed the flow without rushing. Chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a small stage with a projector screen above it, and I noticed the board secretary sitting near the front with a laptop open, already preparing to type whatever the night demanded. I chose a seat near the aisle, close enough to be seen clearly, far enough away to avoid creating a scene by proximity. I placed my folder under my chair, not because I was hiding it, but because I was saving it for the correct moment, when the room would be quiet enough to hear paper land. When Nolan stepped onto the stage, the room shifted into attention, and my wife's posture changed the way it does when she feels attached to power. Nolan began with light jokes, then moved into his polished speech about trust, about standards, about values, and he delivered it with the kind of practiced sincerity that makes decent people relax. I watched him while he spoke, and I looked for the small tells, the quick glances, the subtle need to control the crowd's breathing. He was good, but being good at talking does not protect you from a calendar overlap, and it does not protect you from a receipt with your name on it. Halfway through his talk, I noticed something that tightened my focus in a new way. Near the side of the stage, a staff member approached the event coordinator and handed her a printed sheet, and the coordinator's expression shifted from routine to alarmed. She glanced toward Nolan, then toward the board secretary, and then toward my wife, who had gone still in the way people go still when they fear a plan is slipping. I could not see the sheet clearly from my seat, but I could see the tension ripple outward, because tension is a language that spreads faster than sound. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, and I did not pull it out immediately because sudden movement draws attention. When I finally checked it under the cover of applause, the message was from a number I did not recognize, and it was short enough to feel like a warning rather than a mistake. It said that if I planned to pull anything, security had been told to watch me, and it said my wife had already shared context about my behavior. I stared at the screen for one long breath, and then I saved a screenshot without replying, because a threat in writing is a gift, even when it is wrapped in cowardice. I looked up again, and Nolan was still speaking, but his eyes were searching the room more often now. My wife had turned her head slightly, scanning the rows, and she was no longer smiling for the audience. She was hunting for risk. That told me the late twist was not going to be something they revealed to me. It was going to be something I uncovered in front of everyone. I understood then that my wife had not just chosen Nolan, she had also chosen a narrative where I was the unstable villain, and she had been laying that story down like oil on pavement. The coordinator walked to the board secretary and whispered something, and the board secretary's hands paused over the keyboard like she had just heard a word that changed the rules. Nolan's voice faltered for a fraction of a second, and then he recovered with a joke that landed half as well as the first ones. I felt my pulse slow instead of speed up, because this was the moment before the break. The moment before the room realized it was not here to be entertained. I slid my folder out from under the chair and set it on my lap, keeping it closed, because timing is everything when you plan to let silence do the violence. Then the projector behind Nolan flickered once, and the screen changed to something that was not part of his planned presentation, and the entire room leaned forward without knowing why. The screen behind Nolan settled into a clean slide that was not his, and the room went quiet in the special way it does when people realize they are about to become witnesses. I stood without rushing, walked to the aisle, and handed the event coordinator a sealed binder with a single label. Then I watched her open it, as if the paper inside could bite. She did not read my face. She read the first page, then looked at Nolan, then looked at my wife, and the change in her expression told the room everything before she spoke a word. The coordinator signaled the board secretary, and the laptop keys began clicking again, because nothing terrifies a liar like an official record being typed in real time. Nolan tried to step off the stage with that calm authority he rents by the hour, but the coordinator raised her hand and read only the headings, dates, and payer lines, keeping it factual and boring, which is exactly what makes it lethal. My wife attempted a smile that collapsed halfway, because she realized her private story had just become a public timeline, and the faces around her turned from friendly to cautious, like a crowd noticing smoke for the first time. Nolan demanded a pause and tried to frame me as unstable, but the coordinator held up the printed policy page and the receipt-backed ledger, and she asked him to deny one date while the board secretary typed his refusal into the minutes. When he could not deny it without lying, and could not lie without being pinned to paper, the room did the rest, because reputations fall fastest when nobody wants to be the last person still clapping. Security did not touch me, because I never raised my voice or my hands, and the only thing I did was place evidence into the correct hands, then let procedure pull the trigger. My wife reached for me with a hissed apology that sounded like strategy, not sorrow, but I stepped back, looked at her once, and left her standing inside the life she chose, surrounded by people who suddenly understood